FSU can leave the ACC without breaking the grant of rights. We are continually hearing sports media repeat the same talking points that FSU can or can't do this because of this document or that document, or the grant of rights is ironclad. And the talking points usually go just like that. Florida State and Clemson can't leave the ACC without breaking the grant of rights. And when they break the grant of rights, it's going to lead to lawsuits, which must be settled prior to any conference accepting them. And that narrative is completely wrong. And there's a major flaw in the grant of rights right now. I want to give a quick shout out to Regal Knoll, who presented this idea first. And since then, we've had numerous sources confirm the accuracy of this information. But first off, let's go back a few months ago when we told you about the Magnificent Seven forming and the ACC needing 8 teams total to dissolve the conference. We still believe that 8 teams could, in theory, dissolve the conference. However, based on the dynamics which have unfolded with the vote to add Cal, Stanford, and SMU just the other day that we told you about, it has become increasingly unlikely that 8 teams can be wrangled together into actually doing this before that August 15th, 2023 deadline. The informal vote to add teams to the ACC only had 5 teams opposed. So at best, there are 5 teams that are currently on the same page, one of them being Florida State, Clemson, of course, part of that group as well. So 8 to dissolve is probably more of a long-term goal and not something that would likely be executed before the exit deadline. This doesn't mean it's off the table. It's just something that probably is not going to be done in the short term. It's also worth pointing out that an 8 to dissolve comes from a simple majority of the 15 ACC teams, which does include Notre Dame, which, as we have learned, the ACC leadership was stupid enough to allow them to vote on football issues without even being a member in football. If 2 teams left the ACC, they would immediately forfeit their rights to cast votes to dissolve per the ACC's bylaws. In short, this means that to dissolve, you need a simple majority of the number of teams left in the ACC, or the number of teams left with voting powers. Say Florida State and Clemson announced they were leaving next year, then you would need 7 teams to dissolve of the remaining 13. 2 more teams leave the year after, and you'd need 6 of the remaining 11, and so on. And as we've said before, we believe the odds of getting to 8 to leave at the same time will be much more of a long-term goal, and we kind of hope FSU's not around to do that. Which brings us to our next point that we want to make about the grant of rights. The grant of rights has a major flaw in it and probably allows FSU to leave the ACC without breaking the rights themselves. The major flaw in the grant of rights is that it only applies to home games. So rights for any games played in Doak Campbell Stadium belong to the ACC, who has thus sold them to ESPN. As far as away and neutral games, the program you're playing generally is going to own the rights to those and typically agrees to pay them back to the conference or split them depending on the situation. This means that if FSU left the ACC for the Big Ten, the ACC would still control the rights to an estimated 6 FSU home games, but the Big Ten would essentially control the rights to the 6 FSU away games, as long as those 6 games were all versus Big Ten opponents. And they could do this without breaking the terms of the grant of rights whatsoever, just by simply paying the ACC exit fee. So, what you should be asking yourself right now is how much of a reduction in payout would FSU have to agree to walk away from the ACC and join the Big Ten? And we believe the answer to that is very little to nothing. And we'll explain why in just a sec. But first, as always, want to give some love to our friends over at Gramco. Listen, you've watched our conference realignment videos before. You've watched our FSU content. You trust us there, trust us with Gramco. They're doing a massive gummy push right now. you need to get on not only their Delta 8 gummies, but also their Delta 9 gummies, the big boys. Make sure that you go check them out, thegramcode.com. Use code TJ25 for 25% off. All of this comes down to how much additional value the Big Ten, when FSU plays 6 away games against your conference opponents, gains. Think of games like FSU at Ohio State or FSU at Michigan or against USC. Then think about the playoff games, which adds more revenue. FSU makes the 12-team playoff in any given year and maybe wins a game or two. Each time something like this happens, tens of millions of dollars are injected back into the Big Ten. And the point we're trying to make here is that we're pretty certain that adding 6 away games for FSU is almost certainly worth more than the value of all 12 home and away games for the smaller teams like Rutgers, Indiana, Purdue, who are in the Big Ten now. And while it may not approach the same value for the major teams like Ohio State, Michigan as a whole, the entire conference would probably be willing to tighten up a little until 2036 to help get the deal done. Let's work through a quick hypothetical with the actual numbers. The Big Ten's payouts next year are projected in the 70 millions. With Clemson and FSU, two national brands, you're going to see a jump to perhaps 3 or 4 times what the ACC is currently paying Florida State and Clemson. Conservatively, yes, absolutely. Let's lowball it and say 3 times. That would be $96 million in difference right now. Well, currently the ACC pays Florida State $32 million, and let's say the Big Ten values adding FSU's full rights to all 12 games worth 3 times more what the ACC is currently paying. That would be $96 million a year if you did the math. Well, let's say they could only collect on half of those games. Half of the $96 million a year for the Florida State's 12 games would be $48 million a year for just the 6 road games. That $48 million a year is still $16 million more per year than the ACC is currently paying Florida State. And again, we've heard some of the numbers behind the scenes that the Big Ten is offering to FSU, and it is much more generous than just half the payout to join. We've even heard some say that they're going to get the full 100% amount of the value added because of how high Florida State's value is perceived as. The other half of this equation is the SEC. If Florida State goes to the SEC, ESPN doesn't lose their rights at all because ESPN would remain the rights holder. So there's no loss of 6 home games rights, as no loss of value to the conference. In summary, FSU is negotiating, walking away, joining the Big Ten, and leaving the grant of rights on the table with ESPN for those 6 games. So the Big Ten would not get any money for those home games, but they're either going to get that or they're going to stay in the SEC and essentially just be transferring the rights over without losing any home game value. Now, obviously, the SEC has some financial incentive because you don't want to lose those 6 home games value to go to the conference, but it all comes down to how much value FSU adds to the conference and who's willing to pay more for them. So the next time you hear someone tell you that FSU can't leave without getting out of the grant of rights, without some major legal fight, remind them that Florida State is worth 3 to 4 times more than the ACC is currently paying for them, and that the grant of rights only applies to home games. Now, this probably doesn't work with anyone else in the ACC except for maybe Clemson. Their brands aren't big enough and they don't add enough value to the Big Ten or the SEC to matter. But Florida State is worth so much more than their grant of rights is. And so if they were able to get to the Big Ten and only get value for half of their games, or if they were to just transfer their rights over to the SEC, they'd be in phenomenal shape. What's going to happen over the next 4 or 5 days? Are we going to get some kind of massive announcement? I'm not sure. There's a lot that still has to go down, and I think it's going to be a busy few days. But keep it locked here to the channel. Make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. I think we've done a phenomenal job of covering conference realignment. Again, shout out Regal Knoll on the On3 FSU message board. He's done a fantastic job as well. If you've missed any of our conference realignment videos, you can click right here to get caught up on all of them.